Okay, this is Lawrence Romanowski from Calgary, Canada, and Soleil EV Buyer's Guide. And now we'll start to go and dissect what goes into an EV, how to evaluate it against other EVs, and how to compare it to a combustion engine car. And so try to keep these videos relatively short and on topic. So let's talk about the EV battery. Okay. So it's not really just a battery, it's a battery pack, and the batteries come in cells, and usually the cells are combined into modules that might have 8 or 10 or 15 or 20 or so cells in them, and these modules are laid into an array that would generally on an EV comprise the floor of the vehicle. The batteries are expensive. The batteries are heavy. Because they're so heavy, it's critical to the dynamics and handling of the car that they be placed as low in the body as possible and as central in the body as possible. And that's why most EV designs will look the same, because there's only one real place for a practical large battery pack, and that's between the axles on the floor. It has to be armored, because if anything pierces the battery, there is a risk of fire. And so if you run over something on the highway, you don't want your car to catch fire. And so these battery packs are then heavily armored on the bottom. Heat is a major issue for in any electrical components. The batteries need to be kept at in a certain temperature range. They don't do very well if they're too cold or too hot. They like to be at, maybe 30 degrees Celsius or whatever it is. So this battery pack needs to be warmed up, or it needs to be cooled down. As the battery discharges its energy, it'll heat up. This heat needs to be managed. And so between all these battery modules that are laid out, there's coolant passages that run all the way through them. And then they stabilize and keep the battery pack within the correct range. Okay. Now, within the battery pack, there's different types of cells. There's cells that are optimized for power density. There's cells that are optimized through energy density. Some cells are designed to give the maximum power possible. Some are designed for the maximum range. The combination of these cells and the way they're arranged and the way they're all tied together and managed with the power electronics is something the manufacturers working together with the battery companies will figure out. So not every battery pack of the same size will necessarily function the same, okay? Because they might have different types of cells in them. So when you are evaluating the purchase of an EV, the size of the battery is going to be, of prime importance. Even if you've decided on a particular model of car, they'll have several different battery options, and you'll need to evaluate which battery option you want, which will influence the purchase price fairly dramatically, and the range of the car, and how do you decide how much battery do you need to look after your driving needs. Okay, so I would comment this way. The batteries in the EVs can range anywhere from under 20 kilowatt hours, like a little smart car, I think it's 16 or 17, all the way up to 200, which is what the biggest battery in the Hummer SUT is, which is, a mammoth vehicle. It must weigh like 7,000 pounds. Most EVs are going to have a battery in the range of 60 kilowatt hours to 100 kilowatt hours. And most manufacturers are going to offer, a 40 and a 60, or a 60 and an 80, or an 80 and 100, and give you a couple of options, okay? So the battery pack probably is exactly the same. They just put fewer modules in it. So to link the size of the battery to range, well, the missing piece in that would be consumption. So how many kilowatt hours will the car need to travel 100 kilometers? And that makes the most sense for a consumption figure, because it echoes the liters per 100 kilometers we use in Canada. So when we talk about kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, well, the average is about 20 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. A small car, efficient EV, will use about, in everyday driving, 20 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, okay? So if you've got a battery that's 40 kilowatt hours and you use 20 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, you go 200 kilometers. If you have a battery that's 60 kilowatt hours, you'll go 20 kilowatt hours into 60 is 3 times 100, 300 kilometers of range in that. If you've got an 80 kilowatt hour battery and you're using 20 kilowatt hours, you'll go 400 kilometers, okay? So what I would do first of all is I wouldn't pay too much attention to the EPA and Transport Canada ratings, which are wildly inconsistent as they're applied to different EVs. I mean, we've got enough EVs on the road now with enough forums and enough EV websites that are doing range testing on these vehicles to know that the EPA results don't really match the real world. And it's not consistent. It's not like they're always lower or always higher. For instance, no Tesla that I've ever seen has ever matched the EPA rating, and no Porsche has ever not exceeded it by a substantial margin, okay? So for whatever reason, in the testing processes, the EPA has not been consistent in the way it assesses the mileage capability. What we found though is that when we look through the real world data is that, you know, vehicles of the same size and shape with the same batteries go about the same distance. There's not much difference. I mean, there can be, you know, some vehicles might have a performance tire option with a little bit more rolling resistance than a really hard tire that doesn't corner that well. You know, there might be some SUVs or some EVs with a high aluminum content. They might be a little bit lighter. That'll affect it. I mean, obviously a car has better aerodynamics than an SUV. So there are factors which will influence the range, but it might only be 10%. Okay, you're not going to have one EV with a similar size with an 80 kilowatt hour battery pack that's 30% better in range than the next one. It just won't happen. The technology is too similar. The engines come from oftentimes the same people. The batteries come from the same people, the same suppliers. The technology isn't that different from one EV to the other in terms of the efficiency. Okay, so you can actually figure out pretty closely what the range on your EV is going to be dependent on the size of the battery. We'll do another whole video on consumption and range, okay? But for this one, I wanted to just do a deeper dive into the battery. So we've established that you know, they can be made up of different kinds of batteries. They're laid out in different methods, but they all pretty much will occupy the floor of the car because it is, you know, because they are so heavy. Okay, so I hope that was helpful on the battery and the very basics of how much battery do you need to buy to get what range you need, you know, with a, you know, a safety factor in there as well. Okay, thank you very much. And for the next video, maybe we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive on consumption, and then we can do one on charging, and then we can do one on evaluating different EVs. So we'll continue this video series. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.